2, 3, 4 people. All right. We got a good start. Not a problem. We got. We'll fill you in before we get started. So I'm excited about this panel. I'm going to let Eric run with it. We've got a lot of interest in the blockchain space lately. This is one of those topics that we're going to try and focus on. Where do you come and learn about these new things? Where do you learn about cryptocurrency? Where do you learn about blockchain? Where do you go for that, right? On the internet, where do you want to go? So that's one of the things with this space, with this innovation center. We want to be able to provide content like this, so we bring in experts to be able to talk to you, explain how it's being used, how it can be used, what's the future of it, and then so hopefully that's how you get your education on it. I mean, you can do the YouTube videos and maybe it'll be one of ours, but this is a nice safe place where you can come have an interaction. So think of questions. This is an open night. This is a blockchain 101 and where can we go with it. So think of your questions, and you have some great speakers and panelists and moderators. I'm going to bring in Eric, my brother, if you don't know. Eric Wendt is going to moderate, and Loretta from UL got sick this morning. She can't come in. I couldn't even understand what she said on the phone. I had to have her text me. So Loretta works for UL, and Eric's going to sit in and explain why he's sitting in for UL. It's one of the projects we're working on, and he'll explain a little bit more about that. So before I talk too much, go ahead, Eric. Take it away.
Cool. All right, my name is Eric Wendt. As Brian mentioned, I'm his brother and co-founder of a group called Matter Labs. My path to today has gone a long way. I started off as a mathematician, then physicist, then engineer, then coder, then entrepreneur, and now moderator. Add that to my resume. So I do have a unique relationship with blockchain, and I have a decent insight to the back end and how it works, as do a bunch of the people up here. We also worked with UL a little bit on using blockchain for an alternative reason. Most of the people in the audience, you probably know about Bitcoin, maybe some other cryptocurrencies, but there are a lot of uses for blockchain that aren't necessarily necessary currencies. So one thing we were working with UL was we were doing supply chain management. So we were tracking things like strawberries and shrimp and sheep as they go through the supply chain, knowing where they were along the way. And there's some very unique properties about blockchain, which we can kind of talk about through this, as to why that was a great technology for that use. In the scope of today, to give you guys a little context, we're not going to talk about how you can make $1 million on Bitcoin today. We're going to talk a lot about those alternative uses for blockchain. So we're going to talk about using it in other fields like social media, medicine, and nonprofits. So it's not just Bitcoin. It's not just what is it, $11,600 and something dollars?
Yeah, wasn't it 9,000 last week?
Yeah. So it's not just cryptocurrencies and things of that nature. It can be used for a lot of applications. It's a brilliant technology and disruptive to the internet and to the world as we know it. So I'm going to leave a lot of the heavy lifting to people much smarter than myself. I'll let them each introduce themselves, and we'll kind of go around in the various applications that they're working on. So first of all, let me David, you want to kick it off with your...
Yeah, great. Happy to be here. My name is David Cho. I recognize some faces here. I run a meetup group on Blockchain 101, so happy to see some familiar faces. My background real quick, mathematician as well by education. I worked as an actuary. I was a German linguist in the Army, even before that. And then I got bored with finance, and so I wanted to do some real engineering, so I got lucky and I was able to get a job out here in '96, working for DoD, Naval Aviation, Systems and Software Engineering. And I've been doing that ever since. So there's a lot of, if you guys are familiar with Point Mugu, it's a known center of excellence for electronic warfare. A lot of scientists around the area of RF engineering are in there, so a lot of mathy types. And so, blockchain for me brought in a lot of interest together in one place. It's software, mathematics, and I thought it was, and a lot of good politics that I'm sure we'll get into later. So, happy to be here. So, thank you.
That's great. Eric?
Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Maynard. I guess I'll give my default background of me. So I run a company called Electronic Methods. We do app and web development for a lot of different clients, from largest organizations you can think of to startups. I'm also CTO for another company called Healthy MedRecord, which is building electronic health record applications. And that's part of the reason why I'm here, is because we're looking into what things can be used for blockchain and in healthcare. And we're trying to figure out where we want to attack next, because we're directly involved with trying to make things decentralized. I kind of started with college. I went to school for architecture, decided I hated it, then decided to start jazz studies, saxophone player. And I started my tech company while I was in college, building websites for clients. Eventually got so big that I had to hire people to do it for me. So that's kind of where I am today, 5 years later. Still doing the same thing, still building products for a lot of really cool companies and doing a lot with design and programming for web and iOS and Android apps.
Excellent. And Eric, I think you're too modest because you've been one of the best people I've met, you and Brian, in terms of understanding blockchain. So you've been kind of my go-to people. So, I'm Vanessa Bechtel. I'm the president and CEO of the Ventura County Community Foundation. I am not a blockchain expert, but what I am is obsessed with blockchain technology and how it can be used to increase and enhance social good, improve the nonprofit space, and get more money to the people who are the intended recipients. And I see about 1,000 opportunities within the blockchain space to do that. It's going to take time, I think, to be able to leverage that, but I am really excited about the technology and was honored to be invited. So thank you.
We're very glad to have all three of you. You guys are definitely experts in your own verticals, and we would love to hear what you guys have to say. With that being said, I would love to start off with David. Can you give us a quick breakdown, maybe for the audience's sake, what's the difference between, say, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and blockchain, so that we can have kind of a foundation to talk about the rest of the things we're going to talk about today?
Right. Well, those are all kind of all in one box, right? So blockchain technology really just describes the core technology behind Bitcoin. And, Bitcoin is the first implementation of that technology, that was first described in the white paper in 2008. And, going back a little bit before that, you guys all remember what happened, in those years. It was the big market crash. There was a lot of people in the U.S. that were really kind of not trusting centralized banks and financial institutions because they felt like there was a lot of corruption that ultimately drove those crashes across real estate and finance. And so born out of that was this white paper. And then, out of that came politics around the idea that, centralized models are weak and that it causes layers of cost in products and services that necessarily not need to be there, because some of that may be coming out of inefficiencies and corruption, especially when those centralized models get bigger. And so that's really where it all stems from. And then what other people are doing with different types of blockchains, different types of business models, is that they look for those centralized models that are weak. In other words, a true economy should root out weaknesses in business models in that they're inefficient, corrupt, or unfair, or they have practices where it makes people difficult to get into those areas. There's these obstacles there, especially in finance, that make it hard for just any of you to get in and create an exchange, to create a bank, right? To create a bartered exchange, to create a commodities exchange, to be a money transmitter. It's extremely difficult in both the legal aspect of it and also from a financial aspect. And so what kind of people is that kind of business open to? People with connections and people with a lot of money. And so it's not a good model. There's a lot of corruption, I think, in that model. So I'm sure my peers will all go over all the different types of technical details on that, because there's a lot of differences along different use cases.
Yeah, I think we could. So Bitcoin being one of those, there's a lot of other type cryptocurrencies out there. Eric, maybe you want to go over some of the other ones, like Ethereum or other popular ones that are out there right now.
Sure. The way I like to think about Bitcoin is anything that can have a transaction can be applied, blockchain. Anything that's a transaction can be added to what's called the blockchain. And blockchain is nothing more than a ledger of transactions. I give you $5, put it in the ledger. Let people know. When you get into sometimes you may have heard the concept of mining, and that's people who are making sure that transaction is quote unquote legal. Does, Brian wants to give Eric $5. Does Brian have $5? We need to check that first. Is this a valid transaction? And they do little mathematical tests, little games basically that miners play with their computers to do that. And then they get rewards for doing that. Usually in the case of Bitcoin, they receive some sort of financial benefit. But a transaction can be anything. Like you could transaction money, you could transaction physical objects, and it could be water bottles. In the space of healthcare, you could be it could be worrying about pharmaceuticals, making sure that you know who's handled that pharmaceutical. And you could be even more abstract. You maybe want to keep track of who is this person married in their life? Who is this person loved? It could be anything that's tangible or at least has some sort of value that can be passed around is what we see. And Ethereum, as was mentioned, is kind of one of those places to do that where it's based on contracts. So instead of dealing with transmission of money, it could be transmitting ownership. Be like, who owns this car? Who owns this house? And keep track. A public ledger is the idea behind it. It's something that everyone has access to. It's completely public. You can go download the ledger of Bitcoin today if you wanted to, and you can look at it. It's all encrypted, and it's there's not a whole lot to read from it, but you can get it, and you can start mining yourself. That's the whole idea behind it. Is this information is publicly accessible, and it removes the barriers of centralized systems that want to protect the data and hold it and own it because it's profitable. And blockchain is coming around and saying, no, let's give it to everyone. And then we're figuring out all these really creative uses for it, especially in what I'm focused on in healthcare. So, yeah.
So when I first got started with understanding blockchain, it made no sense to me. And one of the hardest parts of this whole topic is the fact that it's full of industry jargon. So I know that when we first started, about 4 people raised their hand and said, hey, I know about blockchain. When I first started to learn about blockchain, it was hard for me to understand 2 things. What is it? Okay? And what it really is it's a single source of truth that anyone can see at the same time. So when we go back to the adoption of the internet was all about getting access to information. The blockchain is about getting access to value. It's a way to do transactions with one another or with different users around the country or different organizations without needing to necessarily know who the other person or the other party is. It's a way of building trust. It's a system of doing transactions. And they use the terms public ledger. For me, because I have a background in finance, it was easier for me to conceptualize it as my accounting system and to kind of understand the inefficiencies within an accounting system. So let's say you come to the Ventura County Community Foundation and you go to write a check. I actually have someone that has to then take that check, data entry it in, okay? We don't all get to see it simultaneous throughout the organization. It gets entered in, gets posted, and there's a lot of different steps along the way that are largely driven by our own human capacity. The blockchain makes it more of a system where it can be done instantaneously, where we all get to see the same thing. And what is so interesting about blockchain and why it becomes so confusing is that because we are familiar with blockchain via the Bitcoin platform, the Bitcoin is a public, permissionless system. We can all transact on the Bitcoin platform. But blockchain is something that can actually be isolated to just a few organizations or within one organization. So it can be permission-based, where it can be isolated to just the people who have, or the organizations that have permission, or it can be permissionless and just totally open source like the Bitcoin. But I think it's really important when you go down and we kind of orient all of us on what it is that we're talking about, that we really start to understand it from the fact that it really is about creating value, kind of creating a single source of truth where everything gets captured within the blockchain, and it's almost impossible to really change past transactions. So it's not impossible, but because of the way that the technology works and things get blocked together, it makes it very difficult to go back in time and change things. So it creates a consistent historic record of transactions.
I think you guys touched on some great points, and help me maybe distill this down. It's the distributed ledger concept's really interesting to me. Like I think a lot of times of Google Docs, where we can all access the data at the same time and all see it. So then when something changes, we all have access to that data, as opposed to it hiding in a database somewhere where I'm not really sure who's managing it, and who's changing it and who's updating it. And the other point I really like that you pointed out, it's really hard to go back and change previous blocks. So there's a consistent log of all these things happening, right? So you have this transparency that allows all of us to feel trusted in the system, right? That it's not somebody behind the scenes turning wheels and gears and whatnot.
Yeah.
I'd like to kind of start going into our individual verticals, unless you want to.
Sure. No, I would love to do that. I focused in several different use cases in my practice of applying blockchains. So of course I have a set of use cases around finance, because there's a lot of power there when you employ blockchain on that. Social media is huge. I love social media because when you look at why Bitcoin isn't a part of your transactional daily life, is because when you buy a product or you buy a service, you have to look at the supply side of that product and service, right? And you got to understand that those people that are building that product or service, they have material costs and they have labor costs, and most of that, for the most part, right, is all done with fiat currencies, with government-based currencies. What's really exciting about social media supply side businesses is that when you consider buying a ticket for an event, right, what are the labor and materials behind that? Not considering the actual venue, right? It's social media. What makes an athlete be able to bring in ticket sales to an event? It's social media. So when we talk about what kind of economy is most ready for the entire supply side going over to blockchain, it's those businesses and those models that rely heavily on social media to generate revenue. And there are social media blockchains. One in particular that is very powerful, called the Steem blockchain. I recommend you guys look into that. It's STEEM. And what they're doing is monetizing your social media networks to the point where you can have liquid value, in that you can take those tokens and you can exchange those tokens for Bitcoin. Bitcoin being the reserve cryptocurrency today, you can now hold that for value or exchange that for US dollars, so that you can go to Ticketmaster or StubHub and buy your tickets. And so there's a lot of interesting models around that, where Steem blockchain understands the power of being able to start at the root node of supply-side businesses that's all about social media, and then empowering every one of you to have your own social media token, so that you can actually be valued across the globe. You can have a market cap based on your social media network, based on the size of how you and your fans are interacting with you. It's very, very exciting what blockchain is doing in the social media space, in addition to finance.
Sure.
and in addition to a few other applications that my colleagues here will go over.
And I didn't believe David at all on this until I joined Steem It with him and tried it out. And I think I'm up to like $30 just from liking and posting. So if you guys want to try out a really cool social media blockchain,
Right.
I definitely recommend it. And some of the people on that make thousands of dollars off
There's-
a given blog post.
And, when I do my meetup, I usually like talking about it. So I go to this one lady who does makeup tutorials on Steem It, which is a front end to the Steem blockchain. And a typical post for her will be tens of thousands of dollars. It's hard to believe. I always have to show people that when I tell them, because they don't believe me. And then I show them her wallet.
I can vouch.
And then you can see how she's taking that money and taking it to one of these crypto exchanges. And she's getting Bitcoin for it. And then she's getting US dollars for it. And when you think about this, you don't need to know. Any business that builds all social media should not require anyone, including a girl that only understands makeup, to understand how crypto works. And that's how this blockchain works. She just blogs, and then she earns.
And it's possible to do because there's not a central institution. So in our normal Facebook world, Facebook is a centralized source. So Facebook profits off our own ability to create content. the difference with the Steemit, which has been so fascinating from my perspective, is the fact that you actually can get compensated for creating high quality content. And you get that compensation by interacting with other people, and there's no centralized source. There's also no real way to control what other people do within the Steemit community. So you really rely on other users to help you identify good and interesting content, and also to keep away different abuses within the space.
I love that you brought up Facebook, because that's a great point. All of you are thinking, Twitter, Facebook, they're just going to crush anyone, right? That goes ahead and starts using the Steem blockchain. And when you think about it, they don't even want to get into this business. They don't. In fact, they want to kill it. They want the government to regulate it, because they don't want this to be any bigger than it is now. Because the fact is, they have shareholders that would dump their stock if they were going decentralized.
And it's really interesting, too, because when we think about regulatory climate, when we think about the blockchain and the ability to move away from only having centralized institutions like Facebook to a more decentralized participatory system, it changes the way we do business. It changes the way that we interact with each other, or gives other alternatives. And there was a really interesting article about how social media was going to become more regulated, more like utility companies, right? Well, the alternative to that is through the blockchain technology, and giving individuals an opportunity to interface without a centralized source controlling the access to the content.
Right, and it brings up another point, because I get a lot of questions, from the meetup. So I'm sorry if I'm talking too much. Just throw something at me if I'm hogging too much air. But the decentralized, a lot of people think, well, it's decentralized, so it's total chaos, right? It's anarchy. Well, no, it's not. What it really means is it's really putting the root of power of any blockchain and distributing that across all the nodes of that blockchain. And what's behind a node? It's a person, right? You are running the software, and you are joining that network. So you are providing, that consensus that says, yes, that person who wrote that blog deserves that much, right? It's not a board. It's not a single entity. It's the blockchain. It's you. And so when we talk about true democracy, blockchain represents that, and that no decision is made without consensus. And that consensus comes from the blockchain, comes from you.
I can see where I'd be comfortable with a democratized system for my social media, but I'm a little nervous how that would work in healthcare, where it's definitely a privacy-focused and restriction-focused industry. Can you tell us a little bit about how blockchain would apply to that?
Yeah, so this is one of the difficulties with healthcare and utilizing blockchain is the fact that it's public is a concern because patients don't want their information exposed. And the reality is, as much as we'd like blockchain to be this uber super secure thing, there are ways to trace it back to individuals. And we're looking through healthcare in a lot of different aspects of how we could use blockchain, because it doesn't have to just be used for patient data. It can be used for supply chains. Let's say they need to keep track of who's handled this pharmaceutical. Right now they keep track of those things of how that's been delivered and who's touched it. Basically, they need to know that. That's very important information because someone could get very sick from mishandling of it. Blockchain is something that helps that because that is information that should be public. Right now it's centralized. It could also be used for electronic health records, but there are some issues with that, primarily being these large organizations in healthcare want to control the data. They've controlled the data since electronic health records have started to exist in the 80s and 90s, and they're profitable. So if you go to your hospital and say, I'd like to get my electronic health record, please, so I can send this to another doctor, they'll say, okay, it's about $1 a sheet, about $1 a page, and you'll get it delivered probably in about a week or two. Or they give you access to a patient portal, which usually costs something, or you're not allowed to access it, or they lock down access after a month or two, and you can't get access to it anymore. And having a blockchain makes a lot of sense in that case to try to decentralize things, but there's two issues in healthcare. One, the information you can't leak someone's personal information. And I consider kind of myself a HIPAA security expert in dealing with issues of compliance and making sure that people's health information doesn't get leaked. It's something I worry about every day. It's a huge concern for me and the products that we're building. And having blockchain make all of that public, even if it's encrypted, is still a risk. So then we start going into the difference between public blockchains and private blockchains. And a private blockchain is basically a blockchain that only certain institutions have the ledger, but they spread it out. So let's say we get in a situation where every hospital in the country decides to switch to blockchain, and they all have access to the ledger, and they're all checking each other. And that's great. That's each patient that has a procedure done gets added to the blockchain. Gets added to the ledger. They go see a doctor over in Oregon because they broke their leg while they were, skiing or something, and that can be added to the ledger. That something happened, and then all their information is accessible from any point. And that all sounds well and good, but these organizations don't want it. As much as they want to, and I work with hospital executives on a weekly basis in meetings with them all the time, trying to convince them of why products are good and why you should go in this direction for certain things. And when it comes to ownership of data, because we've been trying to approach it from the standpoint of patient-centered data, where you own the data and the data goes and travels with you rather than being located in these facilities. But the hospital organizations, they're not interested in that. In fact, they've done the opposite of that. They've taken the approach of centralizing even more and controlling even more data through what are called health information exchanges. Health information exchange is a even larger server where all of your data gets put. Let's say it's the data center for all healthcare data in a state or in a city. So what we're seeing, and they've been really pursuing that for the last 5 years, is we have an issue of interoperability about sharing this information. They've gone in now in the opposite direction of saying, instead of making everything public, let's go in the opposite direction and make it all centralized so everyone has to connect to this one system. And that's what we're seeing happen now. And that's why it's going to be very difficult to make blockchain happen in healthcare. But it will happen eventually as we go through this kind of cultural change in our society. And we kind of force them to use it because it has so many advantages.
Well, and there's really good progress that's being made for those that are engineers. The ISO standard, the International Standardization Standards, they're actually working, and the RAND Corporation just published an 82-page document on the standardization within the blockchain sphere. And as we work through some of these issues, I believe that it really does have the power to be transformational. When we think of the ability to start to create an identity, for example, through your mobile phone device, it opens up a system that is right now, very hard for people to access. For example, banking. 25% of the global population cannot engage with a bank, but you can actually develop an identity through your mobile phone. Women in multiple countries around the world don't have the ability to really get their own identity. You can start to develop a history, a log, an indisputable, unchangeable log of who you are via the blockchain. I just want to say two stories that I think helped me kind of really fathom this. One was a story, my dad had a stroke in August. It was his second stroke, and he became paralyzed on the left-hand side. And when I was sitting in the hospital not having any idea how to navigate the medical system, and this actually does have a point, the medical system, I was really worried. I was in total crisis. And what do I do for a living? I connect people to services. So for me to find it really hard to navigate a system when this is what I do professionally, I can't imagine what it would be like for those that are outside the system to be able to navigate that same system. But here's what I realized. There's really three options. Someone has a stroke. They're either going to live and go home and get better, they're going to become disabled, or they're going to die. And the options within each of those sectors are pretty standardized. You need the same type of services. Everybody needs, physical therapy. If they're suffered like my dad did, became paralyzed on the left-hand side, they get ultimately discharged or they don't get discharged. They may be veterans or they're not veterans, but if they are veterans, there's a whole variety of support services that could be available to them. What you have via the blockchain is the ability to connect organizations where everybody is able to see the same thing. So my dad can get, brought into just the hospital that could have access to that. It's all of these other organizations within that same shared system. Doesn't mean that his data has to be available to you and me, but his system can be there, and trigger events can happen and can be programmed into the blockchain so that when he was notified that he was going to be discharged, an alert, a simultaneous, instantaneous alert goes off, and the home health inspector who comes to make sure that your house is equipped for those type of needs could be triggered to call. Also, faxes become kind of obsolete. The other instance that I think in the philanthropic field that was very helpful to me was on scholarships. If you're a student and you're trying to get a scholarship, you may apply, right? You may come to the Ventura County Community Foundation and apply for our scholarships. You may be trying to be a student at CSUCI, have to apply for their scholarships. All the service organizations have their own scholarship platform. But what if we flipped this system on its head, and each student created its own profile, and we, all serving institutions, signed up for the same service technology via the blockchain so that we can screen students and we don't all have to verify the same student's GPA. We only verify it once. Now, the Harvard Business Review published a study in 2010 that said that $1 billion every year goes wasted because of redundancy in bureaucratic efforts. 1 billion every year. Well, in 2010, if you divided 1 billion by the number of students that were actually graduating from high school that year, that senior, you could have written a blank check for $40,000 per student across the country to use for either career technical education or university higher education. And these are philanthropic dollars. So when we think about the blockchain, just in my concluding remarks on this, we think about how can we better leverage philanthropic dollars for social good? How can we use this technology platform to make more efficient organizations and to get shared access? And I see it within the blockchain. And the last thing I'll say is in this last week or 2 weeks, we've seen a woman flip off the president and get $125,000 sent to her. We've also seen a woman who was helped by a homeless man and $250,000 got funded. We know that donors give when they know the person. 55% of gifts with high net worth individuals are because of a personal experience or somebody that they know. The blockchain provides an opportunity to reduce the need or eliminate entirely an intermediary between the donor and the individual, which creates more informed giving. The value of more informed giving is that a person, 48.9% of donors that are high net worth feel like they are a novice when it comes to giving. And the huge majority of them, only 30% of those donors of that gift, of that 50%, close to 50%, actually feel their gift has any impact. What is the difference between a novice and an expert? The donors that feel that they're an expert in giving, they're able to track their contribution after they give it, which the blockchain provides for, and the giving increases. Same demographics, same income, same everything. The only difference is whether the donor doesn't see the impact of their gift versus seeing the impact of their gift. The gift goes from $3,000 to about $14,800. And that's where the blockchain has the opportunity to really impact the efficiency of the dollar, cut out bureaucratic waste, and also help the donors and the participants connect on a personal level. It also is more empowering for the individual because they are themselves able to create their own identity and can communicate what they need as opposed to the big brother approach to philanthropy. And that's my part.
That's amazing.
It's really good. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to give one last speed round. I'm going to ask each of you to tell us what you think in 20 years, how will blockchain be disruptive in the industry that you're helping, and how do you see it going? And then after that, I'd like to field questions. I know we got a lot of people out there with a lot of questions about blockchain, so I want to save a little bit of time for that. So if each of you could think of a quick summary and where you think in, say, 20 years blockchain will be affecting your industry.
Well, I'll put out my summary as it relates to startups, right? Because I'm sure all of you are asking, well, it sounds great, decentralized, power to the people, wonderful, right? Well, I am still running a business. How am I going to make money out of this, right? And it's not so much money on transaction. It's more about money on creating value. Right? So in other words, you start a token for whatever service or product that you're making. Right? You can issue a token. Right? You can issue 1 billion tokens. Right? And you can put out, across various public crypto exchanges, so many, a certain percentage of those 1 billion tokens. If you do your job right, if you develop a business that solves a problem, that drives a demand, then what's going to happen across those public exchanges? You're going to see people buying it. And that demand will show up in a true price. So price discovery will happen on whatever product or service you're offering to the world. Okay? And that's how it should work, right? It shouldn't be price mandated by policy. It shouldn't be a price mandated by corruption. It should be a price mandated by public want, by public discovery. And that's what these crypto exchanges do. So you put out 10 million. Well, guess what? You have 990 billion or million left that you're holding. You've created that much value based on the price the markets are determining. And that's how you make money. Go out there, figure out what centralized models are weak. And go ahead and build a decentralized model, create your token or blockchain. But you should really think hard about creating a blockchain if there's a lot of smart blockchains out there, and put it out there. And let the public decide the value of your service or product. That's how it should work.
I would consider blockchain to be something that's kind of in the early adopter phase. And I see this as it's not a question of if it's going to be disruptive, it's when. And I think now is the time to start investing in and learning about and getting educated on blockchain so you can get your foot in the door before the masses approach. Blockchain has been around since about 10 years ago. Even older with some examples in the 90s that were sort of like it, but actually failed. It's something that's so new and so fresh that there's so many avenues for opportunity. We're just now starting to figure out what to do with it. And it's really cultivated a new wave of innovation and startup that we haven't seen for a little bit, actually. We've kind of been living in the post-app development world, at least from my perspective, of build an app for everything, right? Now we're going to see build blockchains for everything. And we're going to see a huge influx of that. It's going to happen faster than any other industry or any other innovation before it, which is going to be really interesting. As far as in the space of healthcare, I do hope that someday blockchain is used universally. We have such an uphill battle to fight to make that happen because there are currently everyone's going in the complete opposite direction. That is going to be difficult to make that happen. But I do think it is going to happen when the value that blockchain provides just can't be stopped. It'll be similar to the internet with things like Napster and YouTube and avenues that kind of forced our culture and our way of thinking about things to change. Blockchain's going to do the exact same thing. For instance, MIT built an electronic health record system actually called MedRec, and it's based on using blockchain for electronic health record for healthcare transactions. And instead of mining, when you give the opportunity to mine, usually it's based around financial gain. They decided that instead of providing financial gain, they'll give you access to anonymized health records. And that allows you to use it for research and all sorts of big data things. So the people who mine the data get access to the highest priority health records that they can use for research data and all that kind of stuff. So there's so much value of it, as we've talked about, beyond just monetary value. There's all sorts of cultural value, the same way we value likes in our society. Blockchains can be used in that similar context as well. So yeah, it's just a great opportunity to start innovating in just any sector, really. Like everything is going to be affected by this as we come up with new creative ways to garner value out of what this thing is. And you'll definitely be in a world probably 5 to 10 years from now where everyone, we had a couple of people raise their hand today of knowing what blockchain is. Everyone will know what blockchain is.
I've shared about kind of my vision, but one of the things that I didn't share was that the United Kingdom has actually running a trial experiment. And the trial experiment in the UK is to distribute welfare benefits via the blockchain technology, okay? And so instead of having to get checks to all these individuals, what they're doing is actually sending people their funds to their mobile device. And then recipients of the welfare are able to actually self-select as to whether they want to make their use of the money available to the government. It's not necessarily because there's this big brother approach that the United Kingdom really cares how people use their money, but what they're actually trying to do is they do care, but they care from a place of integrity. Welfare recipients are some of the most vulnerable to fraud and to corruption and to theft, embezzlement. They also don't necessarily have a lot of financial literacy. Some do, some don't. And what this exchange between distributing the dollars directly to their mobile device and then also tracking it are helping the people who are participating make smarter and wiser decisions about how they use their money, and they're also seeing a significant reduction in theft and embezzlement. I see an increasing inequality within our community. It's not just me, everybody, we all read it, right? The gap between the haves and the have-not continue to widen. The access and the ability for people to participate in decision-making is also going down. Blockchain has the power to help with voting. There's problems with it. It has the power to give people access to credit and to identity and to land use that they may not have ever had before. It also is a much more efficient and cost-effective way of distributing benefits to people in a way that empowers them. And I'll leave you with this thought. One of my favorite organizations in town is an organization called Food Share. And they're basically a food bank. And they serve 74,000 people per month. They distribute food to about 265 agencies each month. And people have to get somehow to an agency that's distributing the food. When they tracked this in Santa Barbara, it was taking people that lived in Santa Barbara about 3 hours there and back to get to their food bank. Okay? They could have just taken the money transferred to their phone and gone to the grocery store. Okay? If we can figure out a way of better leveraging the dollars, we can distribute $22 million worth of food to these 74,000 people per month in a way that has more dignity, saves them time, and is just all around more humane. We're not there yet. Thank God for Food Share. Write a check to them this Christmas. No, but.
And the other is the generation of a multitude of nodes we should control.
Either way, we can go down the table, but the security of the blockchain is really across all the blockchains are really implemented by cryptographic controls, right? So these things about digital signatures and hashing, these are very well proven cryptographic controls and techniques. Now, the weaknesses, I'm not saying there aren't any weaknesses. So it depends on the type of blockchain, because there's two major types today. There's proof of work, and you talked about a weakness related to proof of work blockchains, and that basically describes a type of consensus that's being built. How is that consensus being built? It's being built by proof of work. And there's another type of blockchain called proof of stake, and there's like delegated proof of stake within that. And there's a different types of attacks there. So there are attacks on proof of work related to control of the computational power across that blockchain. If you have more of it, then you can attack it. And the details of that get kind of complicated because a blockchain is a chain of blocks, and that chain represents a way to protect that public ledger that we talked about. Because if you try to inject an attack somewhere in that blockchain, you have to catch up to the rest of the blockchain in terms of computational power to get your injection to get to the front of the block, right? Really expensive, hard to do. Has it been done today? No. right? Since 2008? No. What has been done is taking advantage and having exploits on poor key management. So when you talk about Mt. Gox, Bitter, and a couple of other exchanges, it's all about poor key management. And I work in DoD, okay? So I know all about cryptographic controls, right? I know all about attacks. We get attacked every day. And it always boils down to not encryption, not against weaknesses, in some cases weaknesses in hashing, but not the hashing techniques that are being used in blockchains, or even digital signatures. It's poor key management. And so that is always a low-hanging piece of fruit for attackers. And that will always be a problem. And so you just have to be very careful if you're building an implementation of blockchain, or if you're using a blockchain and creating a token, you just have to be very aware of how you're writing, for example, on Ethereum, a smart contract, and how you're managing those keys. Okay, so you definitely need an expert, to help you kind of traverse your way through secure key management. Okay, and that's basically the major weakness is key management.
Key management's definitely probably the biggest one. I will say that blockchain itself, the encryption behind blockchain, is probably one of the most tested encryption systems of all time. It's been so well vetted, it's kind of ridiculous. But there are, of course, as we spoke about, key management is one access point. One of the other downsides of blockchain is that it gives you access to every possible transaction, and you can start to find patterns in them. And that's exactly what happened with Silk Road. Is they started to notice patterns of the guy who was operating it, and he was getting sloppy with some of his patterns. And the FBI or whoever was involved to get him was able to track down his IP address because of it. They saw patterns about where things were happening, and they were able to see and start to make assumptions about things. That's the problem with the public ledger, is if it's all public, you can see every record. So what a lot of criminals have ended up doing is starting to play a shell game, where when they handle transactions, they have a group where instead of them controlling the money, they pass the money around in a little bit of a shell game. They all pass their accounts, they pass the Bitcoins around their different accounts. But that can also, again, we come to sloppiness, the issue of key management. This is really a sloppiness issue of the people that are using it. As we said, the blockchain itself is pretty secure, and being able to modify the blockchain is basically impossible. But if you're talking about keeping data secure and keeping people's personal information secret, there's a lot of avenues in order to corrupt that. One additional thing that happened recently was, oh my gosh, it just slipped my mind. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I just forgot it. I just had a really good example.
Well, let me talk while you think about that. Chain Analysis is a company out there today, and they have big government contracts. And like you mentioned, all they do is do analysis on blockchain, because government's very interested in understanding who is behind these big transfers of value across blockchain. They're very interested in that. So, none of us here are telling you guys to do all of your illegal activity on blockchain. In fact, we totally think that's a bad idea. Right.
And it's not just,
Well, I actually don't think you should do any illegal activity except for maybe a few miles. But whether it's on the blockchain or not. But the one thing I would suggest, if you're really interested in learning more, the best course I have taken was on the Linux Foundation. Do you know the Linux Foundation? Linux. And they have Linux. See, this is me. I'm not I'm not in the field. But I did watch this course, and there's about 7 chapters, and it's free, and it runs on the edX platform. You can watch it on your mobile phone. But what you do see in there is, I actually started very skeptical, and I became much more confident in terms of watching the process by which data is protected and your identity can be protected. And I highly recommend that training, because you can see it visually, whereas we can explain it. It's really hard to just visualize it, but this was very good, very well done.
It's a really good point, and I would probably piggyback that by saying another good way to do it would be to join the blockchain meetup group,
Thank you.
That happens here as well. Maybe piggybacking on that, like you guys said it's so secure, but I've seen all these recent articles about $50 million in ether lost and all kinds of other kind of things. Can you describe quickly how that's still possible within this?
Not a security issue, it's more of just a keeping of the records issue.
Well, I mean, the DAO, the big old failure of a smart contract that got put out a couple of years ago, which actually caused a fork in the Ethereum blockchain. Because what happened was there was this weakness in this one smart contract, and tens of millions of dollars got sucked out of it in value from that contract. And so Buterin, who is one of the founders of that blockchain, decided that he didn't want to reward these criminals in their attack against that contract. And so he forked the Ethereum blockchain. So when one fork kind of reversed that attack. So all that money, all that value that got pulled out of that contract got put back onto the Ethereum blockchain, but it was only on that fork. The other fork still had that attack in there. In other words, all that loss in value to some hacker was still in there. And what's really interesting about this is you would think, I mean, if I were to ask you guys and took an informal poll, I bet you most of you would think, oh, all of the nodes would probably have voted to go on the fork that didn't have the attack. Well, that's not true. The longest blockchain on Ethereum now is the one that includes that attack. Yeah.
That's super interesting.
On the company-to-company one though, there's also a proof of authority. So it's not always, you don't, if you use blockchain within inter-organizations, you don't actually have to just do proof of work, which is a public process. You could also just do the proof of authority that you have the ability to actually be the one making that transaction. So there's other systems, and so when we're thinking about it, I always think about it from my own company's perspective. How could we connect with other companies? We're not going to all of a sudden open up all of our donors to having their privacy compromised or to make their contributions public. That's not part of our plan. But we could see value in working through a blockchain technology with other service providers, other community foundations, the government, because the government is our largest funder. And so proof of authority might be a better model there. Yeah.
It's public versus private blockchains, which is, it's really interesting.
Okay, I'm going to go through some of the first ones real quick. You had a question in the first round, and then I'll wrap back around. Did it get answered? Okay, cool.
That won't be a long question.
No worries, Dan.
Maybe you touched on this just a hair, but I was wondering if there are any concerns about governmental regulations.
Oh, I'm a fan of government regulation. Okay, here's why. And the reason being is I don't think, as an investor in the crypto space, I don't think I'll get the traction that I would really like. And look what the value is right now with no traction, right? 11,000 per Bitcoin. I want to see a lot more traction in the economy, and I only think we can get that if we can pay our taxes in Bitcoin or pay our taxes in crypto. And I think that as some of you may become leaders in this space, in this crypto space, and may represent, a big portion of the crypto economy. Take that forward to the government and say, this is how the crypto industry would like to be regulated. And we can push that forward. There's been examples of bad cases of that, like in New York with the bit license, right? Where it was more like one-sided government, this is how we should regulate anti-money laundering laws and crypto, and they didn't take a lot of good input from the industry. We can change that. We can, as a community, define what would work for everybody, including government. And so there's some very interesting thoughts there, right? When you go around your day, less than 1% of transactional experience that you have, a lot less than 1%, is on Bitcoin. And it's because government hasn't embraced it yet. We need to get government to embrace it. Because I'm DOD, right? So I know that we need that tax dollar to pay for our defense, because we are getting attacked. I mean, how else are we going to do that? So it is a concern for me. I would like to see more regulation, smart regulation on that space.
We absolutely need some regulation, as you said. Of course, as we all know with government regulation, things go bad very quickly. you know, obviously we need government regulation just to get it proliferated and get it out there, especially when it comes to currency. And a lot of other countries are already doing it. I think, doesn't Canada already have like a cryptocurrency version of their system or something?
Yeah.
There's a lot of other smaller countries that are doing that as well. What we have to avoid is, there is a possibility that blockchain is developed for decentralization, but it could be used in a centralized way. And I think that's one thing that we need to try to avoid when we're going about, as you said, our smart legislation, and making sure that those kind of things happen.
Yeah, because I think that's the antithesis of the whole blockchain would be to regulate it. That doesn't make sense.
Well, but there isn't a solution where it's not regulated and it work, right? I mean, we can't keep working this less than 1% of the economy forever, right? It's just not going to be feasible. It's gotta grow, and it's gotta grow beyond the constraints of where it is at today. The government is not accepting.
I would say like it would be the difference of regulation of saying how you can use it versus you must use it everywhere kind of thing. Like that would be the two different ways of regulation.
I think the other thing to think about here is there's not just one blockchain, and there's not just one cryptocurrency,
Exactly.
right? And to have one that is regulated, whereby you could have a wider use of it, but still have private blockchains, and still have Bitcoin, and still have other ones, but have one at least that's regulated by.
There's a
government.
lot of interesting ideas around universal basic income that's actually enabled by cryptocurrency.
Well,
Right.
getting ISO standards and making sure that there's actually kind of guidance on how to build a blockchain that interfaces with others and is, to me, is on the regulation side, if we could get this right now,
Sure.
it will create systems that can actually interchange together.
Completely.
And there has to be a recourse for people who have been burned from the system, so that they feel safe.
But that's the
Yeah.
whole thing, is that when you look at this situation, it's all based on freedom.
Yes.
So as we're talking about a lot of the nefarious things and the problems that happen,
Yeah.
but if you look at it, it's the new Renaissance,
Yeah.
because it provides access, which in the Renaissance period, only the aristocracy had access to the books and to the information, and that's what blockchain is doing. So when you look at 08 and 09, it weeded out a lot of the fat or people that were BSing, and that's what blockchain does. It takes out the BS, so you can't lie anymore. It makes things more transparent in terms of transactions.
How wonderful would it be if you saw a political campaign completely funded by crypto? Any citizen
gonna
can
happen.
audit all of the
So-
funds going in that
Yeah.
campaign and out.
Well, blockchain is what Netflix was to Blockbuster Video.
Right.
You know, so it's just gonna be something that's gonna be very,
That's
it's gonna permeate everything. It's gonna
That's a good
permeate
point,
everything.
is we're trying to discover right now, is it something that's gonna become so big that it kind of regulates itself and it just happens no matter what? Or is it something that's gonna need forced input in order to make it happen?
Well, it's just
That's
like,
a
it's just
debate.
like regulating gravity. It's something that's ubiquitous, no matter what you do, where you can't escape it. So that's the same thing with the blockchain. It's just gonna be something that's out there that we can all take advantage of. But I think we should really be talking about, not today, but I'm just saying, thinking in ways that it can empower us.
Well,
Because
that's why
it's
I think
it's for the people.
I mean, we represent a true democracy by value, right? You know, practice kind of goes away from that from time to time, right? But the ideas of our government is a true democracy, right? And we need to get back to that. And we can get back to that via blockchain. I think politicians understand that once you know, they understand how those technologies enable that. Right? Because now you're empowering everyday citizens to understand what their politicians are doing from a monetary perspective.
Well, but that's the confusion, because you got the cryptocurrency and then the technology that powers it. So that's what the blockchain is. It's not really like they're, even though that they're somewhat modular and connected, they're completely, separated.
I think you guys all have really good points. I think a lot of this likens to the beginning of the internet. I think we're in a similar
Yeah, that's all it is.
This could all be freedom, but early on, everybody was afraid of the internet and what would come about it and all
Well,
those
I mean, because
those
if
things.
you think about it, it's the Y2K theory.
Sure.
Like, everybody thought the world was gonna end when the clock turned
Right.
over and it was the year 2000. So it's the same thing. Anything new is going to be attacked, and it's going to be, you know, somewhat, you know, there's a democracy within that. It's, you know, no one really understands what the technology is, but if you do understand it, and that's one of the reasons why I came here, there's a lot of opportunity.
So I think this is a good spot. I think we've got I want to make sure we thank everybody, but I think this is a great spot where everyone who's more than welcome invited to stay,
Ask
keep
questions.
talking,
Sure.
chat. The panelists are going to
And I
stick
think
around
we
and
can
ask
pick up
questions,
this
but I think
entire
we.
conversation at the next meetup.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good place to do it. I
Yeah.
just want to give everybody a chance to get out, move around, and then talk. This is a great conversation.
And especially, I'd really like to extend a huge thanks
Yes.
to all three of our
Right. I wanna
panelists.
make
I
sure
think
we
it's
do
really
that. Stick around. You guys want to get food and stuff in the other suite if you guys want to hang out, ask more
Ask
questions.
questions for sure.
Heated debates. I love it. It's great. I think we can talk all night on this. Thank you guys all for coming tonight. I know it's late. We're here all week. The schedule's
You guys were awesome, by
online.
the way.